everybody, welcome back. This is Lindsay. We're talking about Wes Craven today, our dearly departed, recently departed master of horror. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger and Scream and all that good stuff. For me, Scream is kind of the end all and be all. I remember when it came out, I was, 14, and just being totally freaked out by it because I lived in a house with a lot of big windows and just in a big backyard where, people could hide and run around and put their masks on and God knows what else. And Skeet Ulrich, of course. He was my guy. So I don't know if anybody else shares those feelings about Skeet Ulrich, but that was kind of it was a big deal. He was a big deal for me.
Can I top your Scream story with one of my own?
Absolutely.
Yes, the Scream also. Okay, when I was younger, I was not a horror person at all. I mean, just the preview for Gremlins when I was a kid freaked me out, and I wouldn't sleep for days. And when I saw Scream, I had just had knee surgery. I had my ACL replaced, or repaired, and my mom had rented me some movies. This is back when you could go out to the store and rent movies from the video store. I mean, an old VHS player. Okay. And she came back with this bunch of movies, and she's like, I know you kids like these scary movies, so I thought I'd just get you one of these. Now, me and your dad are going out for the night, so you just have a good time watching these movies. Nope. I am incapacitated on the couch, and I kid you not, a freaking storm came up that night. And I'm sitting there unable to move, high on drugs, watching Scream while there's a thunderstorm going out, and the phone rings. And so I think that was the beginning of the end for me when it came to scary movies.
I don't have any words.
That's
incredible. I can't even.
I wondered if I'd get to find out one day what it was that made Sherry finally snap.
Yeah, that was it. That was it.
You're all making me feel older because I actually saw Scream in the theater.
Well, it was shortly. I mean, it was after it came out in the theater. I mean, it was it was the same year. It was just out on VHS by that point.
Yeah, I mean, I could have seen it in the theater if I had been aware and
17.
But well, yes, that too. But yeah, like I wasn't old enough or aware enough or whatever enough to realize that part of it was very satirical and very self-conscious and kind of self-dissecting in the way of, how they drop all the names of the other horror films that are dropped throughout, and just how the character of Randy is always talking about the conventions of horror and how, what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do, and the virgins and the whatever. So, I did not get any of that meta stuff. I did not get any of it. I just, that mask, it is scary.
Yeah, it's like the Shatner mask.
Yes.
If we want to go to Halloween.
Absolutely. And
it's go ahead.
Well, it's become an icon in itself. Which is interesting for something that I guess I was alive to experience, if that makes sense. Like, you always think of, something iconic being something, it has to be from before your time.
Right.
But, like 9/11 and Red Eye, this is the Scream mask and the Scream phenomenon is something that we were all alive and well to experience.
Another example of Wes Craven's, artistic sensibilities, the Edvard Munch painting was the inspiration for the mask.
Yes, absolutely. which is one of my favorites. So maybe that's why, looking back at it now and watching Scream, I'm just kind of a fangirl for this movie, actually. With the screen painting, with Skeet Ulrich, and I also am a little bit of I have some profound nostalgia for the 90s, so
yes,
all of it just hits me right in the feels.
Yeah, not that either are the top of their art form, but Cherry can tell you that when I canceled on Saturday, part of it was that I was slightly freaking out that I had watched the 6th Nightmare on Elm Street movie, by which time we were well in the 90s, and all of a sudden there was a song by the fucking Goo Goo Dolls guy in that thing. I'm like, can this possibly get me back any further into high school?
Exactly.
I'm having the most sophomore year moment of my life right now. Yeah, and Max, go ahead, Lindsay.
I didn't make it to 6. I didn't make it. Sorry.
There are rewards to making it to 6. It's actually the one with the Nintendo scene in it that I remembered and was trying to maddeningly place somewhere in the series. You have to go all the way through.
The original Nintendo?
Yeah.
Yeah, the NES.
The NES.
And hold on a second. And the effects, the movies kind of break down at that point, but God, the practical effects in those later films were just so much better than the movies they were in. You forget how creative that era was, when both Craven and John Carpenter and all these guys were kind of at their peak, and the effects houses were just doing all that stuff that scared the crap out of us.
So the thing that I wanted to add about this is a good contrast to something like Nightmare on Elm Street, where obviously the Freddy Krueger mask is another iconic piece of makeup, and in contrast to the Scream mask, it's just kind of both ends of the spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
The Krueger mask is obviously it's intricate, it's, gory and gross. And
but it really allows Robert Englund to act, whereas the Scream mask, you're really limited to body language.
Absolutely. And that's kind of weird and kind of ironic, because you'd think it would be the opposite, with the more complicated mask being the Freddy Krueger mask, and the Scream mask being so simple. And so, it's black and white, and it's still this thing that haunts our dreams. And definitely kept me up a few nights.
Oh, yeah.
What's that, Cherry?
I was just saying nervous giggle, which means we still are haunted to this day.
Exactly. It's
that is something I was thinking of too, Lindsay, in terms of, we'll get into this when we start talking about New Nightmare and the meta-ness and, the kind of horror, looking at other horror that defined his later career. But it is interesting that, in the 80s, when he was part of that gaggle of directors who formed the really iconic slasher villains of the 80s, that in creating Fred Krueger, he created this big, larger-than-life, iconic character. And when he went to create the Scream franchise, which was on the other side of New Nightmare, which is always interesting to me, he went to create the most anonymous and random and characterless kind of villain that you could have. And I think that he probably did that for a lot of different reasons, but in doing so, he kind of helped to define two different eras. And as Max said, Robert Englund just took that kind of one-note creep. This was the interesting thing about the Nightmare on Elm Street movies is Freddy's name didn't start popping into the title, and it didn't start being about Freddy until maybe the second half. And rewatching the first film, it was amazing to me to go back and see just how long it took, about 3/4 of the movie in, for the words Fred Krueger to even be said by a character.
Right.
It was literally just a nightmare. He was just a creepy child killer who had some terrible power, and it was through making these films over and over again and letting Englund express himself and letting this character develop that we got Freddy Krueger, to the point where the second half of the series was really about Freddy Krueger, to the point where he's almost, the protagonist and the character that the audience is rooting for. Whereas, the first three movies, at least, were definitely more about the people in harm's way and the people trying to survive him, the people trying to band together against him. It was a really interesting change in tone for the series, and it kind of shows what happens when a monster becomes an icon,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Kind of
And
like, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, speaking of Robert Englund, if anyone is a fan of the show Workaholics, there's a recent episode where Robert Englund makes a pretty hardcore cameo, and it's hilarious and terrifying, and I urge you all on the interwebs and everywhere else to check it out, because it's hilarious and terrifying, and
he's actually a really funny guy, Robert Englund.
It's so funny, and it's
he is hysterical.
It's just bizarre because he's so ingrained in our minds as Freddy Krueger, right? That to see him in this totally weird, just hilarious role it's a mindfuck. It's weird. Of the most enjoyable sort.
Or another example is, I know it's getting close to Halloween, so of course Bravo is probably going to have their top 100 scariest movie moments, and it's
right.
always interesting to see Robert Englund fanboy about some of his favorite horror movie moments. It's like, yeah, he's known for playing this horror icon, but yet at the same time he's one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's, important, because I think we forget a lot of the time that we're all just horror fans and we all can enjoy it together.
Yeah. And the people making the stuff grew up loving the stuff for the most part, and hearing them talk about this, that's always a pleasure. Wes was actually pretty good on that too. I'll make sure to link to this longer interview, but him going off about Night of the Living Dead and other films that kind of got him off the ground and out of. I mean, wasn't he a professor of humanities somewhere before he decided to just start making porn and grindhouse horror movies, which has turned out to be his real calling? I'm trying to recall. He had some kind of academic career before he got into all of this, which is one hell of a career path to consider.
He briefly taught English at Westminster College, and he was a humanities professor at Clarkson College of Technology.
Good call, Mike.
Whoa.
It always struck me as pretty funny that you go to learn English composition in undergrad from the guy who would later make Last House on the Left.
Right, that's a leap.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at least he understands literary construction and how to do a story arc.
That's true. That's very important.
And when he started doing, and the Scream is kind of interesting as far as that goes. Did you guys have a chance to check out Scream 2?
Yes.
I was surprised at how well that held up, personally.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And how nerdy and literary it got in the end. I think that between Scream 2 and Scream 3 were a very interesting moment for me, because there's a thin little line in between the two of them, and where you're going exactly meta enough and then too damn meta, one after the other. And it's hard to explain how that works. But if you recall in Scream 2, we had the movie itself, we had the book, the true crime book within the movie about the first movie. You had the movie of the true crime book about the first movie in the movie. And then you had a play within a play where the Nev Campbell, or the Sydney character, was being menaced by a Greek chorus with white masks, just showing how far back that trope goes. And all of this is kind of dancing around in the middle of it, and it still all works, and it all holds together because the actors and the characters are just doing such a great job. I thought that Nev Campbell is kind of the moral center of that weird meta universe. It's always a pretty genius move. Everyone remembers the speeches from the clued in characters about, oh, don't do this, don't drink, don't have sex. A sequel will always include these elements, and that's actually not a whole heck of a lot of the movie. And those characters are not the ones that really have the moral weight. When you go back and look at it, it's much more about Sydney and Detective Dewey and all of those guys just kind of trying to survive in an insane world. And that's...
I forgot which podcast it was. I think it was the Schmoes Know podcast that actually really did a good job of describing the Scream series, and that it was Neve Campbell's character trying to deal with the fallout of her mother's infidelity.
Yeah, if you can send us a link to that, Mac, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, I'll see if I can dig it out. Yeah.
And that's kind of the interesting thing that struck me, especially about the first two Scream movies, was that morally speaking, and as far as character sympathy goes, they're not on the side of the meta douchebags. They're kind of anti-meta douchebag, which is kind of an interesting thing for a series of films. I think most people, if they don't talk about it much, remember as, the ultimate 90s meta douchebag movie. So, and then in Scream 3, they brought in Jay and Silent Bob and Carrie Fisher and Jenny McCarthy. And
oh, God, yeah.
Yeah.
What?
Which is the other side of that line for me, where the movie becomes so meta that it completely spirals out of control.
Yeah, no, that wasn't jumping the shark. That was taking the shark out for swing dancing. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
And as we all know, sharks don't swing dance very well, so
Ooh.
It was just a bad idea.
They get very bitey. They're not happy about that.
Lindsay, I think you mentioned that you didn't want to venture far beyond 3 because that's when they start getting ridiculous.
Right.
Sherry, Mac, did you guys, in our rewatching efforts, venture beyond 3 for this one?
I couldn't do it. I've watched Beyond 3 before, but I couldn't do it again.
I only was able to get to 1.
Yeah. Well, 2 is really interesting because it starts out strong and then goes completely off the rails.
Yeah.
I think everyone remembers 2 is the weird one, which is saying something in that series. Because in that one, apparently Freddy doesn't live in dreams. He tries to possess people through a magic diary. And then a guy turns into Freddy and he goes on a rampage and kicks over a barbecue. It's all very, very weird.
The original Voldemort.
I didn't even get that part of it. I mean, I knew that I could figure out that he was no longer haunting people in their dreams, and that's part of what threw me. It was like, okay, so the initial premise of this whole franchise is now no longer the initial premise. Like, we're not doing that anymore. And it's like, so what makes Freddy special? What makes him different from any other, serial killer? Yes, the hands, I suppose, but
yeah, you can get those. Wolverine's got the same ones, so
yeah. So
somewhere
it was just bizarre. However, I was happy with Larry Fishburne, as he's called in the credits. And
I know
because I thought that it was just going to be some weird cameo, and no, he was concerned for those kids because they were his kids.
Yeah, the whole series is kind of a gold mine of actors showing up just before they got huge. I think that as horror fans, we can all kind of recognize that, Mitch Pileggi aside, that some of the best places to see, later huge careers start is in a lot of old slasher movies because they made 8 of them each time, and the actors were just young enough to be starting their careers then. I think Johnny Depp is the most famous one, Nightmare. But it was cool seeing Larry Fishburne, and it was cool seeing a couple of other people just pop up and like, oh my God, it's baby what's his face.
Every time I see the screen that says introducing Johnny Depp, I just freak out because it's like, again, he's an icon, and we think about iconic things being before our time, but there was a time when Johnny Depp was new and young and, when nobody knew
unknown.
Nobody knew who he was.
And not just And
Odd.
not just in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Nope, go ahead. I'm done.
And not just in front of the camera too, but looking at some of the people who work behind the scenes. I mean, I believe it was Frank Darabont who did number 3, and he would go on to make The Walking Dead, Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile. Sean Cunningham, who produced Last House on the Left, would later direct the first Friday the 13th.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's these series tend to mentor people, and that's without even counting the effects guys and the effects houses that become iconic later.
Right.
So it's very cool to watch some of these things kind of come up in the world. And yeah, Robert Englund especially, I think that's Sherry and Mac, I kind of put the question to you. When exactly in that series did Freddy go from being this kind of horror, this, dirty child killer in your dreams, to becoming the fun hero of the whole thing? Because at some point, I think somewhere around 3 or 4, the series took an interesting turn, and it kind of got Friday the 13th or Halloween to the point where, you're now kind of rooting for the snotty teenagers to be killed by the cool, charismatic monster. I'm trying to figure out exactly when that happened.
That is a good question.
This is always one of those.
Wait, my mistake actually. Frank Darabont didn't direct it. Frank Darabont was a writer. The director of the third Nightmare on Elm Street was Chuck Russell, who directed The Mask with Jim Carrey.
Oh my gosh.
So if you want to say
guilty pleasure.
I guess I want to say that's kind of where Freddy's sense of humor really started coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking that those two characters would have an interesting meeting in hell.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of see how that the one thing would affect the other.
But that's only after Freddy defeats Jason.
Yes.
And there is a comic book series that I want to get my hands on where you have Jason and Freddy meet Ash from Army of Darkness.
Oh my god.
Oh, wow.
With the chainsaw?
Yes.
Yes.
And then someone throws in an alien and a predator just for the living hell of it.
Oh, no, you had what was it? It was in the 90s, Dark Horse Comics, you had Batman versus Predator, I believe.
You're kidding.
I'm not kidding. No, Dark Horse is where it's at in the 90s.
Oh, wow. I need to go find Batman versus Predator.
I think Batman would win.
Yeah. Learning so much today. So yeah, about as far as charismatic monsters go, who else would you put up there with Freddy? I mean, you've got Jason Voorhees and Mac. Who was the
silent?
Yeah, who was the stuntman who famously did Jason and the Predator?
Oh gosh.
Oh,
that I couldn't say because when I hear Predator, I can only think of Jean-Claude Van Damme, but he was actually fired and in production.
Oh yeah, forgot about that. Kane Hodder, that's right, that's who that was. And we've got these kind of.
When was Kane Hodder Predator?
Let's see. I thought he was to begin with.
I'm looking. Let's see. Kevin Peter Hall was the actor for Predator.
Oh my god, I totally forgot Jared Padalecki was in the 2009 Friday the 13th. Sorry.
God, okay, now we're all just abusing IMDb for our own fun at this point.
Oh, no, I was seriously looking up. Oh.
Yeah, Mac, I think like the closest comparison I can think of to kind of monsters and actors making those big changeovers would be either the Universal monsters or would be the Hammer horror films and Christopher Lee back in the 70s.
Definitely Christopher Lee.
Where you've got the actors that get into the role so much that it stops being a monster and starts being kind of a quiet protagonist. So,
or you have Ashley Williams, who went from being this very useless, almost reluctant hero in the first Evil Dead to becoming the full double-barrel badass that we know in Army of Darkness.
But he still couldn't remember the damn line from the day the Earth stood still.
Necktie, nickel, nectarine. Definitely an N-word.
Oh, God.
But speaking of the charismatic villain.
Shocker.
I'm thinking, no, I'm gonna maybe get made fun of for this, but Vampire in Brooklyn, just because the kind of, I think maybe starting with Christopher Lee and going into Frank Langella and then you have Interview with the Vampire, of course. Vampires have in modern times taken on this, sexy.
Bleh.
They're not scary. They're sexy and they're seductive and whatever. And I was really surprised by Vampire in Brooklyn, actually. First of all, that the guy from the dad from Friday was in it, and Dwayne from A Different World. You guys remember that? And Eddie Murphy as this, I thought it was going to be totally lame and totally stupid. He kind of pulled it off, I thought. And Angela Bassett, who is always a joy and a wonderful addition to anything. I thought it was actually pretty okay. And, yet it was not unique in that it, he turned into a wolf at one point and he was missed at one point. And so it was like, I've seen this before and it's not that exciting, but it was an interesting exercise. And the guy from Friday was in it, so gets points from me.
Period, yeah. Craven really had a lot of people to work with on that movie. I was just watching that before we got down to this call, and I think that was the time in Eddie Murphy when he was doing that, he was doing The Golden Child, and he was doing a couple of other things, where it was every movie was a contest to see in which one Eddie Murphy could try to cop the weirdest accent. And that's always a fun contest to watch.
And for Vampire in Brooklyn I don't know, when I see him trying to do the impressions, that's probably the one time where it didn't really work for me like it did in Coming to America or for Nutty Professor.
Yeah, and that also kind of brings me to something that is visible in the Scream movies and in that one, is that sadly one of Wes's weaknesses, and maybe just because he was of his time, that kind of early 90s period where you had films like Friday that were goofs. But one thing that hasn't aged well, even in his good movies, is that none of the black characters talk like normal human beings, unfortunately. And you got this kind of exaggerated, kind of hip, overly referential jive talk whenever you got a black character on screen in most of these movies.
People under the stairs?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Somebody get Lawrence Henderson.
What about Lawrence Henderson?
No, somebody get Lawrence Henderson.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's good jazz.
So that was one thing where he, unfortunately, his films really don't stand out. I think both he and Kevin Williamson, some of the screenwriters who worked with, just had this very early 90s hip alien view of any younger black character that they tried to write. And that just kind of, that doesn't stick very well when you've got, in Scream.
No, it's very jarring.
Yeah. I'm glad that has kind of gone the way of the dinosaur. And but
then all it did was just give way to people like Diablo Cody, who just kind of made it worse.
Yeah, and that was kind of its own thing where, it's not limited to race either. You just have overly hip people trying to sound overly hip, and that's one of the worst poses to either strike at the time or to age very well. So that's one of the areas where watching the Scream movies was not a pleasure. That, and they called the fourth one Scriform, which I'll never get over. Do you guys remember this, where they couldn't print it without putting the 4 in the word?
Yes.
Oh, like Fan 4 Stick or Fantastic Four, whatever they did with it. 7 did the same thing, but 7 kind of worked.
Yeah.
Right.
in general, that's an urge to turn down.
It's a very 90s thing.
It is.
Yeah.
Best friends forever.
Well, Zodiac, they did it cool. Although Zodiac didn't really have
True.
it, just had the symbol in it.
Mhm.
That worked.
Sure.
That worked.
So, final
But
thought on the big Wes Craven series of the 80s and the 90s, the big iconic ones. You guys happy to have seen them over again? I know that I am.
Oh, for sure.
Of course.
Mhm.
Scream forever. Scream 1 forever. Speed Ulrich forever.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, as a kid, definitely did not appreciate the references. And
Not at all.
Yeah.
all
the
of
one
them,
thing
really.
And the one thing I really, I guess now looking back at Scream, at least the first one, that was Wes Craven's subtle way of saying, hey, if you like this movie, check out these other movies that had
Exactly.
an
Mhm.
influence on me.
Yep.
Mhm.
And now that we're all old enough and not scaredy cats anymore, we can actually watch those movies.
Yeah.
It's great.
I had the misfortune of actually seeing Town That Dreaded Sundown, the original, and you want to talk about tonal inconsistencies. That
Mhm.
one was just really, really tough because you had these scary, like, almost pre-slasher murder sequences, and then you have the bumbling redneck cops.
Mm.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Well, when was this from?
Oh gosh, Town That Dreaded Sundown, I want to say probably early 70s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and they've already had a remake, of course, because
Which I've heard was actually legitimately scary, but I got to get around to that one.
Mhm. God. Oh, Ben Johnson. Okay, cool.